Give me a little intro there, Gomer.
There's no turning back now.
Let's put on the show.
You're listening to the Station 71 podcast. My name is Mario, and this week I'm joined by my co-hosts,
Beth
and Brian.
So we actually have some news this week, which is weirdly exciting. As of the day that we're recording this, the 21st, some of the theme parks in Orlando have submitted plans to reopen. Disney, however, did not. We do not have any news yet at the time of the recording, but I did kind of want to go through some of the stuff that we do know. As of the time that we are recording this, both Disney Springs and Universal City Walk are open in some capacity. There's like takeout options and stuff, but we'll get to that. However, Universal Orlando submitted their proposal to reopen today. Their reopen date targeting June 1st for their team members to open or to come back to work. So the 1st and the 2nd, they would bring in their staff. June 3rd would be an invitation only, and then June 5th would be open to the public. They highlighted some of their like proposal ideas, which it seems to be following the trend of what we're seeing with like City Walk and Disney Springs in terms of like their opening strategies. You have to wear a mask in the park, which we kind of saw coming, and they're going to do some social distancing things as well. How do you guys feel about all of this reopening stuff?
I'm pretty surprised that we are just getting the announcement so close to this. Like I don't really know, I'm definitely no expert on this, so it's not my place to say like, oh, either this is too early or they should have done it sooner. I just find it very surprising that, it's like 2 weeks before they're going to actually open back up that we're hearing about it.
Yeah, I have very high hopes for any of this being a good idea, to be completely honest, just based on people being stupid.
So it's important to note that these are just proposals. By the time this episode comes out, we'll know if this is actual like definite information. So this is kind of going to date it a little bit. But the plan is for a lot of these things, they'll submit the proposal and then the governor will have 12 to 24 hours to actually like make that decision if they're allowed to reopen and approve it. I think that that's a good call. I also think, like Brian said, it's very weird that it's like we're 2 weeks out from this time frame that Universal's projecting. But it's crazy. I actually, when I heard that they were announcing these plans to reopen, I was kind of hoping we would get some kind of like look into what Disney's doing based off of Universal, but I actually, for once, don't see that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I kind of thought that this was going to be like Disney's going to see how Universal announces, and then they would kind of, try to match that. But I don't know. I think Universal, they definitely have tons of people that are coming like to vacation at Universal, but I also feel like they get a lot of local traffic too. I guess maybe they're banking on the fact that a lot of the locals will still come, whereas Disney World is thinking like we need to give people ample time to plan because that's how most people come to Disney.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I also think that it could be that Disney is waiting to see how Universal's actual opening goes. Not to say that they won't announce their opening date before, I don't know, Universal's gets back into the swing of things, but I don't think that Disney's going to open at the same time. I agree with you on that. And I think that they're going to let Universal be the guinea pigs and see how their operations kind of return to normalcy before they decide how they're going to go.
Well, that kind of tied into like the whole Universal City Walk and Disney Springs thing, because City Walk opened, I think, 2-3 days before Springs did. So they definitely are looking at it in some capacity. But I was kind of thinking like we would see this plan, like Brian said, and it would be like, okay, here's what Disney's doing, or here's what Universal's doing, and then the other's going to follow closely behind that. But tying that in with our actual next news story, they've removed all of the hours from Disney parks through June 13th. So I think you're right. They are going to watch Universal and see what they do and see how their opening goes and then make the decision. Or even if they submit a proposal to open after, let's say, June 13th, because that's when the park dates are removed through, they may say like, okay, we're going to open on the 14th, and the 14th is our target date for opening. And then Universal goes through all of their openings and they don't go well. Disney still has the chance to kind of like push back on that.
Yeah. One thing too, though, that I think might be coming from this, and this is just complete speculation, but part of them removing the theme park hours is because I have a very strong feeling that they're going to be doing abbreviated hours on the days that they do open and not be open like all day.
Yeah, that would make sense.
I hate to say this because this is like the opposite case of what Walt Disney World typically is. I would say that when they open, it's going to seem more like they're catering to that local audience just to get like a testing on what things are going to be like. Now, we know that they don't usually do that, so it wouldn't be surprising if they don't go that route. But like you said, I don't think having reduced hours really targets a visitor from a couple states over.
Oh, definitely not. I mean, yeah, if you are, able to go on a Disney trip once a year, once every couple of years, you're not going to be planning to do it right now,
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how this all plays out.
I'm also, this is a little bit off topic here, but I'm also interested to see how it plays out for Disney World revenue wise when they first open again, because Disney is that like vacation destination park of the Florida parks. I think they really rely on that travel traffic, and it's going to be interesting to see how many people are going back in, depending on how they open. We don't know how they're going to open. So that'll be interesting to see as well. I do want to make a note that Volcano Bay is included in the phased reopenings at Universal, which just seems very weird to me.
I also noticed that, and I saw this line in the article that you linked that says that face masks are going to be required. Yes. How is that supposed to work at a water park?
It's a good question.
I mean, we're going to see.
A very good question.
Like, what? Also, I feel like for this to be successful, Universal and Disney both, all of the theme parks, when they reopen, really need to enforce masks, because people are not taking it seriously enough. They're using it as like all right, well, now I'm in. Like we were kind of talking in the pre-show about how as soon as you get into Disney Springs, it seems like it's free game. It's like, oh, you can take off your mask if you're eating or drinking, or just for whatever reason. Even if you just don't want to wear it, you can take it off. You just got to get through the checkpoint. And
yeah, which is just
it's going to be a huge failure in, safety purposes if they don't actually enforce wearing masks.
That's so true. And believe me, I am as amped as anyone to get back to Disney, but if it's going to be like that, I'm okay with waiting this out a little bit. If they're not going to really enforce it, if, people are going to be doing that, people are going to be wearing the mask around their chin, then let's just wait.
Yeah, totally agree.
Well, let's actually tie that into this last piece that we have here, is that I mentioned this before. City Walk and Springs are both open. We have the guidelines for Disney Springs is reopening. So I guess we can talk a little bit about those and then tie that into like how Brian was saying, the things that we have to kind of make sure that people are following for this to work. So why don't I read these over to you and we can discuss them, like I guess one at a time would probably be the best bet. So if there's anything you want to talk about, we'll talk about it after we mention what each one is. So for the Springs reopening, the checklist of things that they have to follow is limited parking and reduced entrances. One of the things that I heard was that they're actually requiring people to park in every other space. which is
Ooh, wow.
interesting. Which is, or if they haven't, that's the plan for some of the park reopenings because it'll force some sense of social distancing.
Again, I'm no expert on this, so everything that I'm saying is just my opinion, but I don't see how that is extremely helpful, but hey, if they made that decision, they've made that decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems a little like security theater, like.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we talked about that before. The part of the Florida task force thing was, cleaning theater essentially.
Yeah, for sure.
The next one is temperature screenings prior to entry, which they're doing that with Springs and City Walk. We've seen both of them are doing that.
This is another thing that doesn't really make sense to me because if you have a fever, I'd feel like you're not going to want to go to the parks or Disney Springs or wherever. And even if you do, then you're not going to get in, first of all. And the other thing is that you're not going to start showing symptoms until you already have the virus, right? So, or you're not, like 14 days, isn't it? It's like 2 to 14 days is the incubation period.
Yeah, so you could spread it without even showing it.
Exactly. Right.
Well, so here's the thing. I like this from the sense of like, you say if you have a fever, you're not going to go to the parks. But we all know that that's not true.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess that's fair.
There's plenty of people out there that are going to want to break that rule.
And here's my thinking. Like, you go to Disney Springs, like, let's say one of us decides to go tomorrow and you're going up to the gate and you've passed the temperature screening and whatnot. You're in Springs and someone like 20 feet away from you sneezes. You're going to feel a little bit more secure about that because you know that they've already taken the one factor out of it,
But like I hinted at and Brian said, if someone sneezes and has it and doesn't know they have it yet, then boom, there it is. You have it now.
I mean, I agree with that, but I just feel like
which is why I think masks are the utmost important thing here, which is why I'm so mad that they're not enforcing it.
Yeah, well, that's actually the next one. Face coverings are required for guests ages 3 and up. I guess now is a really good time to talk about that little soapbox bit that we have that all over the internet people are posting photos of guests in Disney Springs without masks, which is so aggravating.
Masks around their necks or on their chins. People are so stupid. I get so mad about this. I'm like, the reason that this is taking as long as it is because of you people. You are the ones. The longer you do it, the longer we're going to have to suffer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And look, trust me, guys, I understand it. It is muggy as hell in Florida, and it sucks wearing these things outside. But like, again, It's like, then I'm just not going to go. If it sucks that bad to wear a mask there, I'm just not going to go.
Yeah, same. Like, I'm only a few states up in South Carolina, but it's hot and muggy here too. And when I have to go to the grocery store and I wear a mask, it is the best sense of relief when I get into the car and can finally take it off. I can't imagine being outside in the Florida sun at Springs or the park or whatever wearing a mask. So I'm not going to do it. I want to be comfortable.
Yeah. That's like, I don't know. My whole thing is if you don't agree with it, don't go.
Exactly. It's like you're ruining it for the people who are abiding by the rules.
I also think that, I hate to say this, but social media and Disney, like the community around Walt Disney World, promotes the sense of I have to be the first. So I see why this is happening. I don't agree with it. And if I was local, I probably would stay away for like the first easily 2 weeks. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wants to be the first, like you said, because that's what social media kind of inspires you to be. And like, don't get me wrong, I would love to go to the parks with lower crowds, without people feeling like they could stand directly next to me. That's ideal park conditions. But I don't want to spend my trip that way, worrying about other people's actions, worrying about touching things, wearing, like we were saying, wearing a mask when it's 90 degrees outside. I don't know.
No,
that's my personal preference.
I
So
completely
that's why I'm
agree,
not going to go to the parks. But I'll tell you, if I were going to go to the parks, that I would be abiding by all the safety rules, which is more than some people can say, I think.
Yeah. I didn't realize that these this thing had actual like details on how things go. But apparently anybody that displays a 100.4 or above fever will be directed to an additional location for rescreening and assistance. Those with temperatures 104 or 100.4 or above will not be allowed entry. Those in their party will not be allowed entry either. So that's kind of nice.
That's good. Now that's something I really hope that they do enforce, that if anybody in your party is showing those kind of symptoms, that you won't be allowed in either.
Yeah. However, jumping down to the face coverings portion, it says all face coverings should fully cover an individual's face, nose, and mouth, and allow guests to remain hands-free, fit snugly, comfortably against the side of the face, be secured with ties or ear loops, be made of breathable material, blah, blah, blah. And it says guests are required to wear face coverings at all times except while dining. The use of face coverings should not be seen as a substitute for physical distancing. So they say that, but we know that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So on top of that, including the limited contact, they've added physical barriers to select places to keep it to keep distance from different things, and they're trying to push a cashless transaction. It says at this time it's recommended all Disney guests use cashless or contactless payment options such as credit cards, debit cards, Disney gift cards, Disney rewards, redemption cards, and mobile wallets. So,
I mean,
a lot of places
recommended but not required.
A lot of places, I mean, this is obviously just up here, but a lot of places aren't taking cash at all just because it's easier to do a contactless form of payment.
Yeah. Here too.
I would think that Disney's
money
probably
is
on
disgusting.
Oh God, yeah.
This is going to be like the most millennial thing that I've said in a while, but I honestly don't remember the last time I used cash to pay for something.
I don't carry cash at all.
Yeah.
Like ever. However, this next one, I kind of want to be a little bit, I'm going to tell you this and then I'm going to read it and then I'm going to say something that I have to cut. So I apologize to future Mario. So the next thing on here is physical distancing and capacity measures. The physical distancing and capacity measurements. So they're going to be obviously reducing the number of guests allowed to visit Disney Springs. And they're also implementing social distancing like markers, which will also like mark out where guests can and can't stand. They've also placed out directional signs to move the flow of traffic in a like unified direction, which is good. However, I will say our grocery stores have done this and no one follows it. So
I was about to say, people, I feel like it's common knowledge. I know that there's different, like in different parts of the world, you drive on different sides of the road, but people generally are supposed to, in Disney Springs or wherever in the parks, you walk on the right side or whatever, but people are so oblivious, even if they're not from another country where you drive on the other side of the road and you're not used to that. People are just looking at things and looking at their phone and not paying attention. I have zero hope that this is going to be an effective measure.
Yeah. And then the last thing that they have on here is that it says we are also training cast members to engage with guests and promote physical distancing guidelines in common areas and queues. I guess we can wrap around to all this later and make predictions on like what we actually think will make it to the parks. But the last thing on here is cleanliness and sanitization. We've increased cleaning and disinfecting in high traffic areas such as public elevators and escalators, handrails, benches, tables, handles, restrooms, and more. Additionally, Disney Springs will open with hand sanitizer and hand washing locations, and guests are highly encouraged to use these while visiting, which we saw that before the parks opened too. They were rolling them out in Magic Kingdom. So I think that that's probably the least of our worries are the sanitizing stations.
Yeah.
So predictions on if we think this is the type of restrictions that we'll see in the parks or if they'll be a little bit more strict. What do you guys think?
I think that the only difference in the parks is that they're going to be able to, well, never mind. I was going to say you'll have to wear a face mask, I'm assuming, everywhere. And then aside from the restaurants, other than that, I mean, I think most of this will stay the same.
Yeah. Aside from the directional markers.
Yeah, there's no way
no
they'd be
way.
able to
Yeah.
do that. I mean, they might have it where they're trying to set that up, but that will not be followed. I mean, and not even to say that like people just being irresponsible. It's just like there's way too many ways to walk around the parks that I think they'll really be able to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think in smaller areas, they're going to have to enforce it, though. I think that that's a thing that's going to make it over there, but in a different capacity than what we're seeing here. Like, for example, there are so many like weird little bottlenecks in Magic Kingdom. And I think if they made it so that you could only go, like, they roped it off so you could go one way in one direction, but like a different direction the opposite way. So you don't have guests weaving in and out of the traffic. That's probably going to make it over there.
Yeah, I could see that in certain areas, especially because they already do that with like nighttime shows and stuff.
Right.
Where they have a cast member directing traffic basically, and you aren't allowed to go one way, or for the parades and stuff. So for certain areas, I could definitely see that being a thing. I just don't think that there's any way they could actually put like markers on the ground like they have at Disney Springs.
Yeah.
That would be enforced
anyway.
anyway.
That'll happen.
Yeah.
I would also be surprised. I know that we've talked a little bit about this. I know that they've been talking about virtual queues. I would be surprised if we see that at all. I don't think that that's anywhere near ready for the Disney parks to open.
I honestly would not be super surprised. I feel
think,
like Rise of the Resistance has been very successful.
Mhm.
I think the Rise does it well, but I think that adapting already physical queues to a virtual queue is not something we're going to see.
But Rise has a physical queue too. It's like a very long physical queue. It's just not being utilized at full capacity because of the boarding pass system that they've implemented.
I'm kind of confused as to how they would even do a traditional queue if you're able to fit, a quarter of the amount of people in the line as you normally are.
True.
Yeah. And then the final question I had for you guys on all of this is when the parks reopen, which ones do you think will open first? Like, do you think that they're going to do them all at once, kind of like how Universal's doing it? Or do you think we're going to see like one park opens, another park opens, another park opens, and then another park opens, or all at once? And then what do you think the capacity restrictions are going to be? Like, do you think we're going to see they allow maybe 30% capacity, 50% capacity?
I'm going to say that I think that they'll do a staggered park opening, and I think that they're going to do a very highly reduced capacity. And I'm saying this mainly because, as I said earlier, Disney World is a vacation destination, and I think Disney as a company already knows that this, for the next at least couple of months, are not going to be profitable to them. Like, that's kind of gone. That's out the window. People are not going to be booking vacations in any sort of amount like they would have before all this happened. So I think that they're going to try to take this slow and, mainly have this kind of catered towards local people to come in and go. And that's going to mean reduced capacity and probably only a couple of the parks open.
Agree with that. The staggered opening, I think that it would make the most sense for Epcot to be the last to open.
Oh, absolutely.
Because
Yeah.
of the nature of the park being literally walking around eating and drinking. Therefore, don't wear a mask at all, pretty much.
Or even think about like how would you even ride Mission Space? You know, it'd have to be one party per thing.
Yeah, true. My question is this though: if they're only going to have one park open at a time, or maybe two parks open, is that going to start counting towards people's annual pass? Like, will that be the date that their pass starts back?
That's a good
because
question.
I don't feel like that's very fair.
No, and
I
honestly,
don't think so.
I feel like Disney would step up and say like, "Hey, things are on a pause." They're gonna say whenever you go back to the parks, the next time is when like your pass starts again. That's how I feel like they would handle it. I think that they're normally pretty good towards pass holders in that regard.
Yeah, that would make the most sense to me as well, it being the next time that you visit.
I would actually also not be surprised if they don't start counting it until they're back to where they need to be.
Yeah.
I know that sounds a little bit like I'm giving Disney a lot more credit than they're probably due, but I think them using annual pass holders to test out how this works is what we're going to see.
Mm-hmm.
I think that with the annual pass holders, they basically already have a free ticket to the park. Like, you know, they've already paid for their way in. The only reason I can see that not working out is because obviously Disney's not getting the ticket sale revenue, but they'll make that up somewhere else. So I don't know. I think that's how this is going to shake up.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
I also think that capacity wise, I would probably say really, really lowballing it here. I'm going to say that Disney reopens with a probably 35% capacity.
I think that's a pretty good number. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then park predictions. Did I say this on another show? Because I feel like I did. My prediction is I think you're going to see Magic Kingdom opens first. It's the castle park. It's the park everybody's going to want to go back to. I think Animal Kingdom's going to be the next one because they haven't had to lay off as many cast members.
Plus, it's the most spacious, so it'd be the easiest to distance people.
And if not that, then I think Studios is the one that opens because it's got Rise. But I think no matter what world it's in, Epcot's the last to open.
Yeah.
For sure.
Makes sense.
Okay. Now that we've spent almost a half hour talking about news, I knew this was going to happen when I saw the
At least we have news to talk about.
when I saw these things in there, earlier today, I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, we're going to spend forever on this. Last thing that we have on here that we want to talk about is our Disney Plus Watch Club. If you're listening to this when it comes out, which is May 28th, the next day we will be hosting a Disney Plus Watch Club from Muppets Treasure Island. If you follow us on any social media, you should have already seen this coming. However, we wanted to remind people how this works because this is a fun little thing. And the last time that we did it, we watched The Last Jedi and spent a really long time talking about a shirtless Kylo Ren. So how this works is we all watch the movie, we get together, we talk about it. It's pretty simple.
You also watch the movie before you come in as well.
Unless you don't really care and you just want to have some fun banter with us, because that's the thing that happens.
We do go over the plot in excessive detail most of the time. So if you haven't watched it in a while or you haven't watched it at all, you'll still be able to follow what's happening.
Yeah. And guys, I have to say, I'm really excited for this one, but I'm kind of worried about how it's going to work out because a lot of the times we spend ripping on the movie, and Muppet Treasure Island is a cinematic masterpiece. I don't even know how we're going to make fun of it.
Honestly, I'm excited for this mostly because I think this is the first, arguably good movie we've watched.
For sure. Absolutely. And it's incredible. We skipped all the middle. We went from crap movies to this.
I would say The Last Jedi is the middle.
I know what I said.
Smart House is the middle.
All right, maybe Smart House was the middle.
Smart House, okay, I'll give it that.
So basically, this is a good time to just come hang out with us and watch, talk about a movie. it's basically like a book club, but for a movie we watched because I'm too lazy to read a book.
It's much easier.
Yeah, no.
Plus,
much
all you
easier.
have to do is have Disney Plus.
Yep.
So come
It's
join.
cheaper
It's
in
a
that
good
sense
time.
too, probably. Look at
Oh
that.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So
Unless you have an Audible subscription that you forget to cancel.
oh shit, thank you. I need to cancel that.
Oh man, now you got another month now. You might as well just download a book.
That's the problem I keep having.
That's how they get you.
Oh, sweet. No, I caught it, but I still have one credit that I need to cancel. I caught it 2 days before.
Nice. You're welcome.
Cool. Anywho, let's roll into our topic this week, which means that I'm going to pass it over to Brian because we're going to continue our bio of Walt Disney.
Yep. All right. So if you guys remembered where we left off on the last episode, it was the end of 1928, and Walt had teamed up with Cinemaphone creator Pat Powers and released Steamboat Willie. The revolutionary film marked a beginning for sound and music being an integral part of Disney animation. Ub Iwerks, Disney's longtime animation partner, had carried nearly all the weight of the animation process. Though Steamboat Willie was making headlines across the country, Walt knew that now was not the time to rest on his laurels. To keep the momentum going, he decided they would have to come up with a series to supplement the Mickey cartoons they were producing. The big idea came from Carl Stalling, a composer that had worked to add music to Plain Crazy and the Galloping Gaucho. Stalling saw the success of Steamboat Willie was due largely to its integration of music into the story. Stalling proposed to take it one step further. He wanted a cartoon that began with music and focused nearly entirely on the music, with animated characters added to supplement it. Inspired by a dancing skeleton toy he had as a child, Stalling wrote music to which the Disney studio would add animated skeletons dancing to the tune. The skeleton dance would become the first Disney Silly Symphony, and Walt again tasked Ub Iwerks with carrying out the animation.
Iconic.
Yes.
Who hasn't seen this at this point?
I feel like every Disney fan has. I mean, it is. It's huge to see, like, you know, how much the music really took off with this, and that was something that just carried through Disney animation. I mean, still to this day. Shortly after work began on the Symphonies, Walt took a trip to New York to meet with Pat Powers. While there, he learned that Charles Mintz, who had previously seized the rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit along with the majority of his animators, had lost his contract with Universal. Told y'all he was going to get it. Walt took great joy in this fact. But more than that, he realized that now they had the opportunity to position themselves as the undisputed leaders of animation. While meeting with Powers, Walt expressed his desire to open their own recording studio back in LA. Music had become the saving grace of their animation studio, and on top of that, Walt believed that they could make money renting out this studio for recording sessions to other independent studios. Powers thought it was a fantastic idea and went so far as to furnish the recording equipment, lend him a sound specialist working at the studio, and even buy the new recording studio and rent it out to Walt for $100 a month, a bargain even in those days. However, Walt couldn't see that Powers was only using these seemingly generous donations as a way to renegotiate his contract for the Mickey cartoons. Upon Walt's departure from New York, their new contract stipulated Powers would not only receive the 10% distribution fee for the cartoons from the previous contract, but would now be paid an additional 25 cents per foot of the negative and an astounding $13,000 salary that would be paid to him for 10 years, and get this, whether or not Cinemaphone was used in their animation. Again,
Wow.
Walt and Roy took out loans and borrowed money in order to secure the funds for Powers' contracts. So yeah, this guy was a very good negotiator and was definitely taking advantage of Walt during this time.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And again, you see this is very, very similar to what happened with Charles Mintz. Walt was still very young and naive at this time and got, pretty far in over his head on multiple occasions. And that's what happened. Back at the studio, Ub was hard at work on the skeleton dance, but Walt was impatient. He had Ub rush the animation to try to get it out to distributors as quickly as possible. After its completion, Walt struggled to secure a contract for the film. Though some critics found the short rather whimsical and unique, most considered it too macabre to show in their theaters. Eventually, though, Walt found a theater in LA willing to pick it up, only on a temporary basis, though, which did give them enough funds to continue with the development of the other symphonies. At this time, Walt was still focused on making his studio the de facto name when it came to animation. Though Ub had been churning out the work, he knew he wouldn't be able to do it alone. Walt began scouting top talent across the country. By August of 1929, Walt had hired Burt Gillett, one of the animators who worked on Felix the Cat, and Jack King, the animator for Aesop's Fables, among others. He now had a team of 8 top-class animators, along with many other cell artists to keep producing his films. What set the Walt Disney Studio apart from many of the other studios at the time was Walt's insistence on excellence. He didn't consider any scenes in his films as placeholders or throwaway, and expected every animator to treat the section that they were working on as the highlight of the movie. Walt also learned from his mistakes of pushing his employees too hard in the past. Though they were working to high expectations, the animators described working at the studio as exciting rather than tense. The success of the Mickey shorts brought a lively atmosphere to the studio. Iwerks stated, "We couldn't wait to get to the office in the morning. We had lots of vitality." Though spirits were up and the studio was producing films that were receiving high praises from critics, Walt found himself running into financial issues yet again.
Surprise, surprise.
Yes, very common theme. His hiring of top animators, studio expansions, and of course the payments he was making to Pat Powers found him barely breaking even on each film they released. On top of that, the studio was mainly relying on the Mickey films to keep them going, as the Silly Symphonies still hadn't been picked up as a series. Walt knew if the studio was to grow, they couldn't rely on a single series to keep them afloat indefinitely. Powers, seemingly coming to the rescue once again, was able to secure a contract with Columbia Pictures. The studio would begin producing one Silly Symphony for them each month, with an advance payment of $5,000 and an additional payment of $3,000 upon the completion. Of course, Powers wasn't doing this out of the kindness of his heart. The contract stipulated that he retained the rights to sell the film to foreign distributors, his regular 10% commission, 65% of the profits until all of his costs had been repaid, and 50% thereafter. So he basically set it up as a way that he, unless the film absolutely flopped and no one picked it up, that he would make his money back first, and then more on top of that.
Huh.
Yeah. Though the price was steep, Walt had his sights set on dominating the animation market and believed the costs were justified. Mickey was growing in popularity, and more than that, his competitors were disappearing. By 1930, Felix the Cat and many of his knockoffs, including Charles Mintz's Crazy Cat, were ending production. Initially refusing to include sound in the pictures, they realized too late the impact it would have on audiences. By then, Disney was chugging along with Mickey and the Symphonies. And though the Silly Symphonies were bringing in money with the new contract and receiving positive reviews, it was Mickey that everyone wanted. Walt saw an opportunity to brand Mickey and bring in even more profits. He began trying to make promotion deals for Mickey comics and toys, but was initially turned away. Surprisingly, the big break came from somebody outside of the Disney organization. Harry Wooden was a manager at the Fox Dome Theater in LA. He noticed the rising popularity of Mickey cartoons and saw an opportunity to bring in more money to the theater. He set up an event to occur each Saturday where parents could drop off their children for 3 hours at the studio. The children would watch Mickey cartoons, perform songs as members of the Mickey Mouse Band, and even took a Mickey Mouse pledge. The promotion was wildly successful. Wooden regularly had to turn people away each Saturday as the studio would reach capacity. After seeing the possibility for even more success, Wooden met with Walt to discuss expanding the ideas to other theaters across the country. Walt loved the idea and went to work. He set up deals with a number of other theaters to do the same, with additional activities and memorabilia to be distributed to attendees. He also went to Carl Stalling and had him compose a song for everyone to sing to kick off each event. In a short time, this new Mickey Mouse Club had over 800 chapters across the country, many with thousands of members. After seeing the success, Walt had no trouble pitching comic and toy deals with distributors, bringing in even more money to the studio. And this was something that I found really cool, just that the Mickey Mouse Club didn't start as an actual official Disney thing, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah,
that is really cool.
Early 1930s saw a surge in Mickey's popularity and a nearly equal growth in animosity between Walt and Pat Powers. Powers began insulting the quality of the symphonies, to which Walt took great offense. We all knew he was very, very protective of his creations.
Well, I mean, can you blame him at this point?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, especially after all the, he's really had the claws way up to the point where he's at now. And, and he still hasn't really made his big break. I mean, Steamboat Willie kind of got him off the ground, but he was still struggling in a lot of ways here. More importantly, though, a large portion of Powers' pay came from the contract stipulations involving profit and expenses, and he began refusing to let the Disney see his numbers. If all of that wasn't enough, Walt also learned that Powers had met with Ub Iwerks and convinced him to leave the studio and work for him. Walt was crushed. Iwerks had been by his side for many years, but Ub felt as though he wasn't receiving the recognition due to him. On January 21st of 1930, he announced his departure from the Walt Disney Studio. Though this confrontation with Powers seemed eerily reminiscent of the showdown with Mintz a few years prior, Walt and his company were in a very different place now. The soaring popularity of the Mickey cartoons gave them an edge this time around. Powers refused to open his books, so Disney halted production on the Mickey cartoons. Powers countered with a lawsuit, but Walt and Roy were ready. Unbeknownst to Powers, the two brothers had been meeting with Columbia Pictures in private. Columbia had already netted an astounding $400,000 from the Silly Symphonies, and they knew they could make even more from the Mickey cartoons. Powers' lawsuit against the studio would nullify their previous deal on the future Mickeys produced and require a payout of $50,000 from the Walt Disney Studio. Columbia was all too happy to step in and make the payment. Now Walt and Roy were finally through with Powers and could produce the Mickey cartoons and Silly Symphonies directly for Columbia. So I thought this was nice that, Walt and Roy finally kind of threw their own little trickeration in there after they've been screwed over so many times by these big name producers and distributors in Hollywood that they finally kind of got back at them. Well, with Columbia further promoting Mickey, his popularity grew even faster, and with success came imitation. Walt learned from an animator working for Charles Mintz that Mintz would buy copies of each Mickey short and run them over and over to analyze the animation and incorporate it into his work. Unsurprisingly, Mintz was never able to produce the same quality as Disney, and his creations never took off.
That's what you get, you shady.
Perhaps other animators were unable to create characters to the same standard as the Disney studio because none of them had the same connection with those characters as Walt did with Mickey. Walt saw Mickey as an extension of himself and poured much of his personality into the mouse. During storyboard meetings, Walt would act out Mickey's scenes, and his animators would copy his movements into the animation. Perhaps most of all, though, Walt's sense of adventure, optimism, and determination shined through. The 9th Mickey film, The Carnival Kid, featured Mickey's first spoken line, "Hot dog, hot dog."
And it has haunted us ever since.
Carl Stalling had provided the voice for Mickey, but Walt was dissatisfied. He wanted Mickey to have a high falsetto voice and decided to hold auditions for the role. However, none of the candidates could give Walt what he wanted. Finally, Walt decided he would just provide the voice. "I knew I'd always be on the payroll, so I did it," Walt quipped.
That's so awesome.
All the while, Walt continued his efforts to grow the studio. Expansions to the building and additional staff were brought in to assist in production. Walt had built up a studio that was now seen as the place to work in animation. Their quality was unmatched, and Walt had done well to create a sense of fraternity amongst the animators. However, all was not well with the other side of the business. By late 1930, Columbia began pressing Walt to expedite their schedule of releases, and were willing to let the quality of the film suffer if need be. On top of that, the contract Walt had signed with them, while far better than the previous deal with Powers, left them with a fairly low percentage of profits and left them at the mercy of Columbia's bookkeeping. Walt was not going to be bested again. With 25 films left to produce for Columbia, Walt met in secret with United Artists, a much larger studio than Columbia, to secure a deal once their current contract was up. It wasn't until April of 1931 that Columbia found out, and by then it was too late. United Artists were all too happy to have the mouse aboard their ship. According to Joe Schenck, president of UA, United Artists is an organization only for the biggest stars. Mickey Mouse, however, is different. Disney has created a character whose type has never been equaled in motion picture history. Perhaps more shocking than the success of the Disney studio itself was the time in which it occurred. The stock market crash of 1929 destroyed many jobs, and the film industry was not immune to the downturn. Theater attendance were down, and many studios had to close their doors. The Disney brothers surged ahead, and the reason for their ability to withstand the crash was simple. While other studios had been busy buying theaters and investing in the stock market throughout the 20s, Walt and Roy had dumped nearly every penny they saved back into the Walt Disney Studio. They had gambled on themselves, and thanks to Mickey's incredible popularity, the gamble paid off. By 1932, Roy had negotiated a new contract with United Artists to add 5 additional Silly Symphonies to the production queue, with a $15,000 advance for each, 30% distribution fees, and, this is the best part, a $195,000 loan for Walt to, quote, use as he saw fit.
Oh boy, I bet he loved that.
Just throw it to the wind.
Yeah, that's dangerous. I mean, we all know how Walt is with money.
Yeah, have you met this guy?
Clearly not.
Roy called it our first good contract. Though, as it had always been for Walt, his focus was not on money, but on achieving the highest possible quality with the animations. Disney cartoons had been seen as superior to their counterparts for years now, and the gap was about to widen even more. Animators at other studios noted that you were expected to come in each week and knock out a set number of feet of film. Some of it was good, some of it was bad, but either way, that's what got made. This obviously would not stand for Walt. He was constantly having animations gone back and reworked, and he even implemented a pencil test process. Animators would be required to create rough drawings for the scenes that they were working on and actually have them shot on film so that they could be viewed and analyzed before final animation began. To help speed up the process, Walt bought a machine called a Moviola, installed in a closet in the studio. It was essentially a small projector for the animators that they could use to watch their creations on a 4-inch screen. The sweat box, as it became known, was frequently packed with a number of animators and Walt poring over the latest pencil test.
The sweat box, bro.
Sounds like the place to be.
Walt also became focused on making the characters in their cartoons feel more lifelike. Up until that point, the Walt Disney Studio, along with other studios, used a technique referred to as rubber hose animation. This meant that as a character's body grew or stretched in reaction to the scene, its volume would change. As an example, if a character's arm needed to stretch to reach an object across the room, their arm simply became longer. It didn't thin out or appear to actually stretch. Walt instead wanted his animators to focus on physics and think about how a character would react in the real world. If the character crashed into the ground, their body would compress upon impact. As they moved, special focus needed to be shown to how their hair would move in response. Gravity became the all-important focus for the technical aspects of animation, and it was met with great applause. And this was actually something that when I went on my cruise, one of the things that they do throughout the day as one of the activities is they have little animation classes. And some of them are just, you come in and here's how you draw a character and everything. But some of them, it was really cool. They talked a lot about this, and it's something that you really don't necessarily notice in animation unless you like really pay attention or someone points it out to you, but how much different it looks where, if you're throwing a ball against the wall, if you just have a circle and it hits the wall and comes back, how much different it looks where if you have it actually deform slightly as it hits the wall and come back. And, that was pretty groundbreaking stuff that Disney was coming up with at the time. And, compared to the other stuff of the day, like it looked far, far better.
That's really cool that they talked about that in the activities on the cruise too.
Yeah, that was honestly one of my favorite things to do on while we did it. I mean, there was so much stuff that I loved, but it was really fun. And I mean, each one was like an hour, and I think I probably went to like 6 or 7 of them over the entire cruise. And it was worth it. There was never one where I was like, oh, I'm ready to get out of here and go do something else. Like it kind of made me want to just sit there and draw.
It's nice to see that they are catering to the ultra Disney nerds on the cruises as well.
Yes.
We're losing Brian to the Disney cruise life.
While the appearance of his films was something he took great pride in, Walt always believed that storytelling was the most important part of his films. Up until that point, most animations were simply a strung together series of gags. Even the Disney studio placed great importance on the comedy, with Walt handing out bonuses of a few dollars every time an animator created a gag that was used in the final film. However, Walt began to focus even more heavily on storytelling and characterization. As new faces like Pluto and Goofy joined the ranks, Walt realized that was what was making audiences come back to the films, was the connection that the audience made with the characters. He was set on giving these characters a sense of humanity that wasn't present elsewhere. In reference to his characters, Walt would say, "We invest them with life, or at least a caricature of life." It wouldn't take long before he found another obsession: color. Over the past few years, the studio had been experimenting with very rudimentary examples of color added to their films. The most they had accomplished was tinting the entire film a certain color for specific scenes, blue if it was underwater, for example. But in 1932, Technicolor announced that they were coming out with a new process that would allow up to 3 individual colors to be produced on a film at a time.
Whoa.
3 colors.
Yeah,
3 whole
crazy,
colors.
wild. Walt knew they had to have it. He met with Technicolor and negotiated exclusive rights to the process for 2 years. But as always, the problem which surrounded Walt but did not gain his attention was money. The new color Silly Symphonies cost more than 3 times what the black and whites did to produce.
Well, they got 3 times as many colors.
It only makes sense. Furthermore, UA refused to change their contract to provide more money for these ventures. Walt cared little. He knew they were onto something. The first color Silly Symphony, Flowers and Trees, was met with rave reviews, and even went on to win an Academy Award for animated short subject. Still, UA would not budge. Even more worrying, to Roy at least, was the fact that they still owed over $100,000 on the loan that they were given, and UA was about to call it in. However, the older Disney brother would pull through yet again. He met with a New York investor, Doc Giannini, who clearly saw what Walt did. He agreed to not only buy out the remaining loan owed to UA, but provided an additional $12,000 advancement for each Silly Symphony they produced. This effectively ended Disney's contract with UA and gave Walt the ability to produce color animations at his own will.
Roy coming in clutch as always.
Sounds about right.
With the Technicolor contract secured, the studio went to work on a new project. Released in May of 1933, Three Little Pigs premiered to audiences, and it was clear that Mickey and the Silly Symphonies were not lucky breaks. Thanks in large part to animator Freddie Moore, this revolutionary cartoon set the style for Disney animation for years to come. Moore's animation style, along with the new technical focus Walt had been preaching, culminated to create characters with unique personalities that moved and behaved as if they were truly their own beings. These characters, along with the earworm Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, composed by Frank Churchill, had audiences hooked. The song itself became so popular it was played over the radio by theater orchestras and was, according to the New York Herald Tribune film critic Richard Watts Jr., inescapable. And I want to read this excerpt that he had written, and I got this out of Neil Gabler's Walt Disney, The Triumph of the American Imagination, which is a really cool book. Disney fans should definitely check out if you haven't already. But
while you're getting to that, I just want to point out how funny it is, the idea of hearing this song on the radio to me.
Oh, I know. It's like
It's very funny.
But According to Richard Watts Jr., it bursts out at you in almost every film theater. The radio hurls it in your direction. Try to escape from it by joining to the speakeasy, and some unfortunate alcoholic will begin to sing it at you. You pick up a paper for relief, and you find it shrieking at you in a cartoon on the editorial page. At teas, otherwise harmless men and women will suddenly burst, either coyly or determinedly, into its unceasing strains or its coy lyrics. Go to the theater, and you will find it played by the orchestra in the intermission, while the handsomely clad men and women about town in the audience join merrily in humming it, just to show you that they are dashing sophisticates. So,
Wow. That's wild.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because I feel like a lot of people, know this song or have at least heard it in some part, but like I had no idea that it was this like craze that swept the nation when it came out.
Right. Is this like the first earworm kind of?
I don't
would guess.
I mean, it was not very long before this that there was even sound in movies. So, I mean, I kind of feel like if not the first, it had to be one of the firsts.
Or at least one of the most like first well documented.
Yeah.
And it's definitely probably the first in terms of like movie standards.
Mm-hmm. One of the largest takeaways from the film for the animators was that Walt had been right to focus so heavily on physics in his demand for the finished product. According to animator Chuck Jones, I realized something was happening that hadn't happened before. It wasn't how a character looked, but how he moved that determined his personality. This new style was loved by audiences and critics alike. Even during a time when so many across the country were struggling financially, Three Little Pigs became a smashing success. Once all the chips were counted, the film had netted the studio $600,000 in profit. Walt again took his money and reinvested it in the studios. By the end of 1933, he had a staff of almost 200 people working for him. It was not only his business that was growing, but his family as well. In December of 1933, after many years of trying, Lillian gave birth to their first daughter, Diane Marie Disney.
Aww.
Walt would not forget about his other first child, though. Even with the Silly Symphonies now rivaling Mickey's popularity at the theaters, the Mouse had one thing they didn't: marketability. The Mickey Mouse Clubs were growing across the country, and Mickey was gaining a number of international fans as well. It was estimated that by 1935, there were 500 million paid admissions for Mickey Mouse films across the world.
Wow.
Yeah. The studio knew this was a market to tap into. Even by 1930, Disney had licensed Mickey Mouse for a number of different products, mainly dolls and toys. Most of these items were cheaply made, though, and Walt and Roy both agreed that this reflected poorly on the studio. Herman Kamen, a master salesman, had approached Disney in late 1930 to help them improve the marketing of Mickey Mouse products. Instead of cheaply made kids' toys, Kamen went after high-end products. He secured deals with Cartier Jewelers, Ingersoll Watches, and General Foods, to name a few. By 1934, Kamen and his merchandising arm of the company were pulling in $70 million in sales between domestic and international markets. Mickey products were now making more money than the cartoons themselves. Mickey himself had been going through some changes. Since his debut in Plain Crazy, his character had evolved greatly. Though he retained his adventurous spirit, he gained a much stricter set of morals. With the expanding market for his products and the fact that he had now become the symbol for the company, Walt was very cautious to put Mickey in any position that might compromise his morals while on screen. Some critics began complaining about this, as it felt as though the Mickey series was becoming too straight-laced. To combat this, Walt and the animators knew they needed to come up with another character, one that would lose his temper, shout, and get into a whole mess of trouble. One day, professional milkman and part-time voice actor Clarence Nash went to the Disney studios to see if they would be interested in his voice talents. He was performing a rendition of Mary Had a Little Lamb, but as if a goat was singing it. Which I think is pretty ballsy to go in there with that as an audition.
That is very ballsy.
In the middle of the audition, the interviewer flipped on an intercom switch which played the audio into Walt's office. Walt was said to have burst into the room exclaiming, "That's our talking duck." Donald first appeared in the 1934 film The Wise Little Hen, and audiences immediately fell in love with him. By his 1935 performance in the band concert, Donald had nearly eclipsed Mickey's popularity. This was a fact the animators didn't mind. They found it much easier to churn out storylines featuring the grumpy duck, as much of the comedy could stem from him simply losing his temper. The success of the short films and the Mickey merchandise had finally placed Walt in a secure financial position. He was no longer tied to unscrupulous middlemen, and he had a large staff behind him to help him churn out his creations. He was undoubtedly the king of animation. This all mattered little to Walt at this point. Money, as it always had been to him, was just the means to an end. The biggest issue he ever had with Mints and Powers was their hindrance on his creative freedom, not the money they were taking in their contracts. Even in the early 30s, Walt began dreaming of something bigger for his studio and himself. He considered his films art and himself an artist, and now his canvas had become much too small. Walt felt constrained by the shorts they were producing. He always wanted to tell a story, truly develop characters, and make an emotional connection with his audience. These things were very difficult to do with a 7-minute runtime. In less than a decade, Walt had showed the world the true capabilities of animation. Sound, color, physics, character development, all these things were considered superfluous for a film before the Disney studios implemented them. The next wall that Walt tore down would be the one that he was most recognized for. The mission moving forward for the studio would be to develop the first feature-length animated film in history. But first, the world's greatest storyteller needed to find a story. In reality, Walt had been toying around with the idea of a feature-length movie for a few years, but hadn't made a move to begin on one yet. As early as 1932, Walt and Roy had looked into the rights for Alice in Wonderland. They had also been in talks with MGM, who owned the rights to the novel Bambi, about a movie deal, but the project fizzled out. Several other well-known stories were tossed around. Gulliver's Travel and Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey were also deemed good choices. But by 1933, Walt had decided on Snow White. Though he knew it would be a while before any real development began, he had United Artists register the title for their future use. By late 1934, Walt believed they were ready. He took his team of animators, including Ken Anderson, out to dinner one night and announced to them his grand plan. Ever the showman, Walt not only laid out the plot he envisioned for the movie, but acted the entire thing out. According to Anderson, the performance lasted over 3 hours, which I just love that.
That is absolutely insane.
The animators were enthralled and excited to begin work on something so groundbreaking, not knowing just what they were signing up for. As always, the concerns of money came up. Walt originally estimated the budget to be $250,000, but as development progressed, that quickly jumped to $400,000. Worse yet, the original investors the studio had on the film backed out. Walt, however, was not going to let that keep them from starting. He convinced Roy to use the studio's profits to begin work, hoping to find investors along the way. When Roy was told that investing all the company's profits into one movie was like buying a sweepstakes ticket, Roy responded with, "We bought the whole damn sweepstakes." Even early in the development process, Walt was focusing on very specific details of the film. During the first storyboard meeting in late 1934, Walt was already specifying how the dwarfs would react to learning Snow White had succumbed to the poison apple, or how a bird might fly by to distract them as they were working. By the time any real work on the film began, Walt had nearly the entire plot finalized in his head and just needed to relate to the animators. Oddly enough, one of the few things that Walt had not decided on was the names of the dwarves. He knew each would have a very specific characterization, and they would be developed, and that they would be named accordingly. Among the ones that we know today, other names were listed, including, and these were just some of the best ones I picked out. There were even more than this. Flabby, Awful, Dirty, Chesty. I'm not sure what they were doing with that one.
What?
Yeah. Sniffy, Burpy, Dizzy, Tubby, and thankfully the book actually explained this one, and Hickey, which he kept hiccuping. Yeah. Anyways,
what? I want to.
Yeah.
Okay, are Flabby and Tubby the same though?
So there were so many that were just like, okay, we get it. They were like going for a fat dwarf, like, but
Yeah.
there were even more.
Aren't they
like
all
that.
kind of fat?
A little, but
They're all a little tubby. That's funny. I really am curious about Chesty though.
Yeah, I really wish they had explained that one like they did with Hickey.
I mean, Hickey's a little bit more
They're
well, no, I don't know.
provocative.
I guess. Oh goodness.
However, finalizing the characters was a slow process. Walt first wanted to write out the dialogue line by line, word for word. He was always scrutinizing the work, making seemingly insignificant changes that in his head would be the difference to audiences. By spring of the following year, they had not even made it to the introduction of the dwarves, and therefore had not finalized their names.
I mean, that's kind of interesting to think about too. Like, we know how much work went into this movie. We know, how much was riding on this movie, and like, Walt really is out here skimming over every little detail and trying to make it every little thing that he can.
It really was. I mean, but just from that first meeting, like he had the entire movie. He knew, I mean, like literally aside from the dwarfs, like he knew everything that was going to happen in this movie. And like, he was so particular about it.
Oh, absolutely.
At this time though, production of the Symphonies and the Mickey shorts were still ongoing, and Walt found himself looking for more workers. The studio had been able to poach a number of high-ranking animators from some other studios, including Bill Titla, Ward Kimball, and Mark Davis, to name a few. However, even with these experienced heads on the project, the workload for the production would require much more manpower. By June 1934, Walt decided that the best course of action would be to pull in as many young animators as possible and train them on the Disney standards. He believed it would be easier to start from scratch instead of having to break bad habits from older animators. Beginning in the spring of 1935, the new animators would have to begin taking classes at night taught by the more experienced ones. The new recruits were lectured on technical animation, background design, storytelling, physics, and all the other unique characteristics that put the studio's animation at the top of its class. Though it was delaying the actual production on Snow White, it was a necessity for the animators to be able to produce something with enough quality to meet Walt's standards. By November of 1935, Walt believed they were ready. A schedule had been set, comic scenes drawn, and the dialogue more or less written. Walt broke the animation into a number of teams that would be led by one of the senior animators, and each would be assigned to a main character to help preserve continuity. However, even with all the new talent that had been brought in, Walt still felt it wasn't enough. In early 1936, he called the studio's lead recruiter, Don Graham, into his office and told him, "I need 300 artists. Get them." A lot of this had to do with how particular Walt was with the help that had been brought in. He frequently let people go that he felt weren't pulling their weight or producing quality work. Nevertheless, by 1936, there were nearly 500 employees at the Walt Disney Studio. Though he was selective, with the employees that met Walt's requirements, he was very friendly, caring, and fatherly. Walt was always keeping up with their personal lives, helping out where he could. He allowed employees to take up to 3 sick days any week so long as it was a legitimate claim. He shut down the studio in mid-August to give everyone an additional vacation on top of the 2 weeks he gave them throughout the rest of the year. Most of all, though, Walt paid well. While most animators were making less than $125 a week at other studios, Walt was paying up to $15,000 salaries for his top animators. If it took money to get the very best, it was money he would spend. In early 1936, animation officially began, even as the new talent was being trained. In Walt's mind, though, nothing was finalized. Though planning had been going on for years, he was constantly tinkering and making adjustments to everything. The plot, dialogue, and above all else, the animation was constantly being poured over by the man in charge. According to Joe Grant, one of the animators, every time he'd come into the room where the storyboard was, he'd tell the whole story of the film over again from the beginning to make sure nobody got anything wrong.
That is really funny, but I bet at the time was probably really annoying.
He was for sure getting on people's nerves at this time. I mean, I think it really was, from the accounts I've read, like people were sticking around because they knew that this was going to be big. This was a huge deal because Walt was very much getting on the majority of the animators' nerves at this time. However, even by January of 1936, the Dwarfs had still not been finalized. It was here that Walt made the decision that Dopey would be mute and take on a childlike demeanor in contrast to the others. More notably, and y'all are going to think I'm messing with you about this, more notably, the dwarf Deafy, whose disability would serve as the jumping off point for many of the film's gags, was replaced with Sneezy. Which,
good call.
Yeah, I don't even know why they thought that would be a good idea.
Man, I feel like if they had gone with that, it would have a thing on Disney Plus. Just like, this has outdated, like, offensive references, just so you know.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
Oh, goodness.
Now, Walt could set his sights on developing these characters. He made it abundantly clear that each dwarf was not merely a part of a collective, but had their own unique personality, appearance, and mannerisms. That in itself was no quick task. It wasn't until January of 1937 that Walt issued a memo stating that he was satisfied with the finalization of the dwarf's characteristics. During this time, though, auditions and voice recordings for the characters had begun. Over 150 girls auditioned for the role of Snow White, including Virginia Davis from the Alice comedies, though it was Adriana Caselotti who eventually secured the role. Even the Queen had dozens of actors auditioning, many of whom were using the same stereotypical witch's voice, of which Walt was not impressed. It was Lucille Laverne who stole the show, bringing a much more evil, maniacal aspect to the character. The animators were not sitting idle as the actors were recording, though, and a number of notable technical developments were going on at this time. Walt's obsession with color had not diminished, and feeling that the paints that were being supplied to them were inadequate, he had the artist grind pigments to produce their own paints. Walt even went so far as to purchase a spectrophotometer, which is a machine that can precisely measure colors and actually output what color they are. And there were only 20 of these machines in the world at this time, and Walt bought one of them just to make sure the colors were right in the animation.
Wow.
Walt also wanted a way to add more depth to the film to create a sense of realism. Ub Iwerks had developed a multiplane camera to use at his studio, so it had only appeared in a few places in his films. Walt had a 4-plane camera built for his studio, and had used one in the Silly Symphony called The Old Mill. The short was more or less a development piece to see if the technology would work for them, but Walt wanted it to be an integral part of Snow White. After seeing the three-dimensional aspects it brought to the film, Walt knew it could be used to highlight their animation techniques even better. By late 1936, one thing was abundantly clear. They were running out of time. Furthermore, Walt and Roy were in a distribution deal with RKO, choosing to leave United Artists in the middle of production. The film had already been scheduled for a December release the following year. That seemed nearly impossible. By the start of 1937, nearly the entire film was left to animate. With final animation beginning, Walt was always present, making minor changes here and there. The studio began working 24 hours a day and 8-hour shifts to ramp up production. This was almost a necessity not only due to the length of the film, but how tedious and time-consuming the multiplane camera was to use. And as always, there was money to consider. Though the initial estimate of the film cost was $250,000, Roy had taken out loans in excess of $1.5 million in order to finalize everything.
Imagine that, a really, really low estimate and having to take out extra money for a project. Walt, no.
Yep.
Do we know what the conversion of that is in today's money? Because I bet that would be too much.
That's a good question.
All right, hold on.
Yeah, let's see.
1937.
1.5 million and 37 to today.
So $250,000, just for the comparison jumping off point, in 1937 equals $4,588,821.
I just sent the conversion of 1 million to the group message
Wow.
there.
Wow.
So 1 million is 1.5 million, right?
No, that's
Yeah.
just 1 million.
Oh, geez.
That's just 1 million because I googled
Crap.
1.5 million in 1937 and it says adjusted for inflation 1 million in 1937 is equal to 18,355,285.71 in 2020.
So 1.5 million today would be 27,532,928.
Oh boy.
That's a lot
Wow.
of money.
That's a big jump.
That's a big loan there.
Yep.
Oh boy, Roy, you must have really believed in your brother.
I know.
Man. Can you imagine the amount of anxiety Walt caused Roy?
Oh, I can't even imagine.
Probably
he's the
too
real
much.
hero.
By September, most of the staff was sure that the film wouldn't finish on time, but they pressed on. Finally, on November 27th, the final cells were painted. And on December 1st, only 6 days before the first preview of the film, the final frames were captured on the multiplane camera. It had been years of work and rework, but they were finally done. And I know so much over the development of like the parks, they cut it so close. But this is crazy to me that they've been working on this for years, and 6 days before its premiere, they literally wrap up the film.
There's no more iconic duo than the Disney company and deadlines.
Yep. Very, very close deadlines.
The film was released to audiences on December 21st, 1937. The reviews were almost unanimously positive. So much of the film was groundbreaking, far beyond the novelty of it being a feature-length animation. The realistic color palette, multiplane camera, character development, music, all struck a chord with audiences. Walt's vision had become a reality. The only question was, would it pay the bills? By February of 1938, the film had grossed $3.5 million just in North America. By May of the following year, it had pulled in $6.7 million after being dubbed in multiple languages and released across the world. Walt had shown what he had always known was possible. Animation was not a gimmick or a way to show funny gags to audiences. Real characters and real stories could be developed. It captured audiences' hearts as well as their attention. Walt had taken a small startup of a studio and a few years later produced the highest grossing film ever at the time. But more importantly than that, Walt was going to show that he could do it again. So that's where we'll leave off this week on Walt's story.
Man. This guy.
This is the part where I tell you guys that I think that Snow White doesn't hold up.
I haven't seen it in a really long time, but it's never been one of my favorites. It's more so always been, I respect it a lot for what it was and how it pioneered full-length animation.
I agree with that.
It's like Small World for me.
Yeah, that's a very good comparison.
Yeah, I don't love it, but I love what it represents.
I don't love it, but it's important.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, any final thoughts before we wrap this week up? Because we are an hour and 20 minutes now.
I think I'm good. I've talked enough.
One last thing before we go. Apparently, while we were recording this, it was posted that Orange County Mayor has come out and said that Disney will submit plans to reopen, or will be submitting their plans next week to reopen.
Oh,
So
okay.
hopefully when we come back next week, we'll have a little bit more news on that for you guys.
Yeah.
Cool.
Woo. And that's going to do it for us this week. Thanks for joining us again on another episode of the Station 71 podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from. If you want to read our show notes or find links to all of our social media, that can be found online at www.station71podcast.com. If you have anything you want to hear us talk about or any ideas for future episodes, be sure to email them to station71podcast@gmail.com. We hope you enjoyed your ride, and we'll see you real soon.
Please stand clear of the doors. Por favor, manténganse alejado de las puertas.